we're going to get into that in a minute. But this is to show you that when you thin and space your property, it makes a big difference. All those trees are the same distance apart, but you can see that the steeper slope, it's actually a ladder fuel there, and convection will catch one tree to the other. So the steeper the slope, the more distance you need to have between the trees in order to prevent a crown fire. Now this is an example. There were some guys that were burned up here, but I thought this was a real good demonstration of the chimney effect and the speed a fire can take. This is the country that it was in, so you can tell it is pretty steep. It's nearly as steep as this chimney. But the fire was down in the bottom of this canyon. 14:30 is 2:30 in the afternoon, and so it was just kind of kicking around there. And then at 3 o'clock, 20 minutes later, you can see that it had grown from there to there. And then from 15:13 to 15:20, it grew from there to there to there. And 15:23, it was here, and 15:24, it had already overrun those firefighters up there and caught them. So fires in steep country are nothing to be dealt with. You got to really take care. But this was a really good thing, and that's what it looked like after it burned. I'm going to talk about aspect a little bit. The direction the slope faces affects the spread of fire. The southern aspect usually receives more direct radiation. It heats up quicker, you get upcurrent winds quicker, and because our sun year-round is more in the southern aspect of the sky, that's true nearly 100% of the time. Fuels there are usually drier because they're hotter, and a lot of times they're less dense. Sometimes, depending on what's growing there, whether it's shrubs or trees, it may or may not be less dense. But it normally receives a stronger slope wind. And there again, the concern was on the south-facing slope in the morning and in the north-facing slope in the afternoon. This is an example of the active fire. That fire had come over that ridge pretty hot, and the convection now wants to go that way, and it's burning this way because it's burning in pine needles and whatever. So it's conductive type heat there, and it's backing down as opposed to convection where it came up the other side. Topography, terrain, is just the lay of the land. Include the obstructions, include ridges and canyon. If you think about the fire and wind like water, it acts pretty much the same as water. In other words, if you take a lot of water and forced into this canyon, it gets faster because there's more volume into less area. It's just like a water hose. You get more water, that's the reason you get your pressure out of your water hose. And fire does the same thing, wind does the same thing. And things like saddles. Do you know what I'm talking about when I say a saddle? It's an area where a canyon comes up and you've got two hills on either side and a kind of a narrow part in there. That's what we call a saddle. It actually looks like a saddle. And it causes wind turbulence. If you're, there again, water, if you've ever watched a stream, you see when a stream hits a rock, it causes a swirl. Well, mountains cause swirls. When it comes out of the saddle, it'll swirl both ways, and when it comes over a ridge, it'll swirl this way, and so it acts a lot like water in reverse. And that's where you can get a lot of your turbulence when you get one of these fires. It's also one of the things that when you look at your house, in areas where you have the leaves build up in the corners and things that's behind your house, it's the same thing that happens there. And those are places where you need to look at when you start looking at places to clean up. fire in canyons or steep drainages are danger zones, but there again, a lot of firefighters get killed in relatively gentle country in light fuel because they move faster. And that is just an example I put up there to kind of look at some of the things that if a fire came over this ridge over here, it might burn backing down this, but when it got here, it would all have probably the wind behind it and also have the slope, and so it would burn a lot hotter probably on this slope than it did on this slope coming down here. And if you have a spotting, spot can actually burn down here and start this up while this is still backing down. But all these little hills and rills here, those cause turbulence. They cause erratic fire behavior and just a lot of things. This is an example of a saddle, but other hills over there. And you actually have a lot of this in the Little Bear Fire, particularly out in the flats out here. You can see where the fire came up those little canyons and actually got to the top of the ridge. When they got to the top of the ridge, convection took them up there, but they didn't burn much on the other side because they were burning. They hit the top of the ridge against the wind, which is what this was doing. The wind's blowing against this fire. I put this in there because in a lot of cases, like the example a while ago where the fatalities were, I've actually been on fires where you're in this steep country and you see a little fire down the bottom, and you know it's dangerous to go down there. We've sat there and watched them. And a little bitty fire down there will set, and one morning, about 3 o'clock in the morning, we were still watching this little fire, and the whole canyon lit up like that. Because it had sat there, and the convectional heat had preheated that whole canyon, and it happened to be brush. But that whole canyon took off at one time. It looked like it was just somebody threw gasoline on it. Fire brands and embers, convection causes heat to pick up embers and throw them up, and they can actually be pretty good size. You get a chunk of wood this big around, kind of thin, and it'll go several hundred yards out there. And you can see in that picture that there's a lot of embers flying around. Embers settle on the homes and vegetation way ahead of the fire front. And so when you're thinning, it does make a difference if there's a vacant lot out there, particularly if it's downwind from you. Or if you have a vacant lot, it makes a difference because in this country, a spot fire can spot 3 miles. And so if you have a vacant lot that's got a lot of vegetation on it, it catches fire, you can be endangering people 1, 2, 3 miles out in front of you. This shows you a little bit about the fire up there. The trees are probably 100 feet tall, and that's probably a 300-foot flame wing up there. It's putting all kinds of gases and debris and stuff in the air, and then the wind currents are carrying them with the wind. That's when they're Colorado, the Black Forest fire near Colorado Springs. I guess they weren't too concerned about it. But the wind adds to effect. We've already talked about it a little bit. It causes short-range spotting, and it also, when you combine convection and wind, it can carry fire brands a lot of distance, and that's where you get a lot of homes are burned. Most of you know about the fire that burned in Los Alamos. They did study that quite a bit, and there are a few homes that were burned around the perimeter, but most of the homes were burned away from the forest and had been set by embers, not by the fire front. Matter of fact, there was a fire in Colorado that burned 169 houses. 19 of them were burned by radiant heat or something right around the perimeter. The rest of the 169 homes were burned by embers sitting things around the house where they didn't have defensible space. And that's just another example. If there's a fire up there and wind can be so severe that it keeps the heat from going up and starting one of those ice caps. If it never gets high enough, it won't form the ice cap, but it'll still spot out in front of it, 2 or 3 miles. And you can see the heat that's generated, the amount of stuff that's thrown in the air when you get some of these jackpot tines and get a crown fire going. You can see the number of, that's a fairly small fire there, but you see the amount of embers that's thrown in the air just from that little bit of vegetation. And you get that kind of a fire in the tree canopies, and it's continuous. There's not much you can do to stop it. And here's an example of spot fires. The fire came up the backside of that ridge, we topped that ridge through embers and things, and started that many new fires out in front of itself. In summary, the elements of fire require fuel, heat, and oxygen in order to burn. Fire spread is spread by convection, radiation, and conduction. And weather and wildfire, temperature, humidity, and wind are bigger factors. And slope aspect and terrain are other bigger factors. Now let's talk about fire and the wild and urban interface. That's a little scary, isn't it? As more homes are added to the landscape, fuels management becomes more complicated. And so it's harder for firefighters, it's harder for whoever. How do we define the WUI? What is the WUI? The wild and urban interface is where houses meet trees. And they start to call wild and urban intermix, where we have houses and trees and houses and trees that are intermixed. And so most of the area we have around here are really intermixed as opposed to just interface. The Waldo Canyon fire that happened last year up by Colorado Springs, burned 300 and something houses, was a wild and urban interface. And they got, what they had is a bunch of homes that were pretty close together, and homes were catching homes on fire. They burned about 300 of them. And examples of WUIs, this is a small community, and I don't even know where it is, but this, remember when it said that south-facing slope are usually drier and have less vegetation? That's a south-facing slope. This is a north-facing slope. You got more vegetation, and these houses are burned or built right along and amongst it. They're even wild and urban interface also is in wheatland and grassland. And then we have places where you have big meadows, and we have lodges and condos and all those kind of things. All those are wild and urban interface. And if you look at that, he hasn't got a lot of vegetation, but that house is on fire pretty good, which tells me that fire, see that little canyon there? That's one of the chimney things we talked about a while ago. And the wind's blowing towards that house, and so whatever fuel was there, it got up maximum speed and got up there and hit underneath his eave or underneath a balcony or underneath something and caught that house on fire. I'm going to talk about defensible space and zones and the small things that we tend to overlook. What is defensible space? Defensible space is defined as an area surrounding structure that will allow firefighters and equipment the space to defend against an approaching wildfire. And so it's not something that the firefighters are supposed to come and clear out for you. It's got to be that way before they get there. Thinking in terms of zones. Whenever FIREWISE got started, and they started talking about what causes fires to burn houses, and of course, when you're in the area right around the house, and we use 30 feet for zone 1, you can have convectional fire that can burn you in there. You also have radiant fire that can burn you in there. And you can also have conductive fire. On the fire that they had out here, we saw several places where tiny ones actually went up to porches and the pine needles burned, caught the porch and burned the house. And so, zone 1 is right around your home. Normally, in this kind of terrain, they should be elliptical, not round, and they should be further down the hill and further towards the wind when you start thinning your property. Zone 1, we talked about the primary space adjacent to your home. And this is a home that we're able to save this home in the midst of the Weaver fire because it had a good defensible space. That country is demolished all the way around there. We actually had some houses out below there that were pretty much the same thing. But that's just defensible space. And I threw this in here because this space isn't very defensible. You've got a house with if this was Ruidosa, the wind would be coming from this way. He's got a lot of fuel in his back door. Here's a place, we talk a lot about trees, but this fire came through here, and you can see 2 houses that were burned there. Didn't burn the trees. So what that tells you is that something other, grass or something, carried the fire underneath those trees and got to a wood fence or a wood pile or something and caught the houses on fire. And here's some, just the opposite. There are many of those houses, most of those houses there are still there, and look at the trees that were burned. So those guys had pretty good defensible space. Zone 2 is a little further out. Normally, I guess I feel in Zone 2, because of the chance of your tree getting on fire and throwing sparks at your house, that it's pretty much a part of defensible space. And the village ordinance, when we wrote that ordinance, we said it can be up to 200 feet downhill from your house. That would be defensible space. Now here's another one. That buffer zone he had around there did a pretty good job. At least it saved his house. He may not have much to do for a year or 2, but he does. And then you go a little further out, and there again, some people don't think you don't need to thin out there, but because of the wind and because of the way that our fires burn here, I think it's important to get as much thin as you possibly can. Now here's a fire. That house right there survived, and you can see it burned hot all the way around there. A couple of things that I see in this thing is that they built this house just a little bit off the slope. They left a little bit of a buffer right there where the convectional heat would tend to go up and over the house as opposed to go within the house. Anyway, that's one of the things they recommend if you're on a steep slope, that you actually build the house back away from the slope a little bit. But that one survived. A lot of them didn't. Now this particular picture is one from the Wallow Fire in Arizona. We heard a lot about it a couple years ago. But this community actually built a fire break right there. The fire came over this hill, back down there, and they were able to catch it and put it out there before it actually got to their houses down there. This is a fire that I just wanted to show you this to show you the kind of energy and stuff that's generated in the saddles and those kind of things. Whenever you get a fire, the wind's blowing this way, and when those things top the ridge, they've got fuels all the way from the bottom of the ridge to the top of the ridge that's burning, and it produces a tremendous amount of gas. I read a paper that said, the researcher said that the convectional flow of air can actually increase the wind speed of up to 50 times. And so some of these things you may have 100, 200 mile an hour winds when you actually hit the top of the ridge. That's what you don't want. You don't want your firefighters there, and you don't want to be there. This is minimum areas, and they've taken mainly slope here. But a flat slope, the shrubs ought to be 2 times apart, and the trees, the crowns of the trees ought to be at least 10 feet apart. And if you live in the winter area, that probably ought to be double. On a 20 to 40% slope, the distance between your bushes ought to be 4 times the size of the bush, and at least 20 feet here. And when you get up to above 40% slope, they say 30 feet between here. And a fire will have a harder time burning and getting ahead of steam if you adhere to these things than if you don't. The small things. This isn't a very good photo, but all along this ridge, all this area around here is burned. But there are quite a few of these houses that survived. And it's because they had defensible space. The fire came up here, and a lot of the heat was dissipated up in the air. I know they got a lot of sparks and those kind of things from that fire. The small thing. Any place you have a vertical and a horizontal flammable something coming together, like where your wall in your house meets your deck, that's a place that a piece of fire can land, and it'll stay there long enough to maybe start on fire. And so gutters are places where litter accumulates. Decks, of course, are wood, and if you get a firebrand that big on a dry deck, it can start a fire. The siding is important. In a lot of cases, we have vinyl siding and those kind of things. You get some of it's not too flammable, it can melt, but it can damage your house. The roof, the windows. What we're seeing now, a lot of analysis they do is how many have vinyl windows? Fire, radiant heat from a fire from as much as 60 feet away can melt a vinyl window. When they melt, they fall down, sparks get inside and burn up your house. And that house is burning, and this was on the Black Forest fire near Colorado Springs, and they had a lot of spotting and those kind of things. I don't know what caused it. I thought it was neat that none of the trees around this house were burned, but the house was fully engulfed in flames, which to me just says that there was something in that house that caught a firebrand and caught it on fire. Caulking windows and vents, any place that you got a draft can pull in a spark. If you have louvers or something, they should be screened so a larger particle can't get in there. There again, gutters and downspouts, wire screens on the window to keep fire embers. Here's an example of things you can do for construction, a metal roof as opposed to a shake shingle roof. And there are other good roofs too. Composite roofs are good too. But then you have the spackling, the cellar walls, those kind of things. Anyway, a spark can get in. And some of the metal roofs too, if you have a metal roof, you might want to check it because a lot of them are channels under that metal that go up and are right against the wood. If those aren't sealed, fire can actually get up under there and start the roof of your house. This was a wall of fire in Alpine, Arizona. The whole town had treated their homes where they had defensible space, and that fire hit them, and that was a 300,000 acre plus fire that ran everybody around for about 3 or 4 weeks. But they only had one home burned in the entire area, and there are numerous situations like these that show that thinning and getting rid of the fuel works. This is one thing that I kind of got a kick out of it. He's got a lot of trees back there. He's got overhanging his house there. He's doing a good job. He's spraying his roof, but the thing that hit me is, out here is a juniper tree. Juniper is probably one of the most flammable trees that we have. And if you got a juniper tree close to your house, get rid of it. But anyway, these things catch a lot of debris and stuff. If that juniper tree catches on fire, it's going to melt that, and it's going to melt that. And all the work that he's done trying to save his house is probably going to be for naught. So that's one of the little things that you learn from FIREWISE. Now this is the Wallow Canyon fire, and these houses are fairly new high-dollar houses. But here you can tell a fire's going that direction, and these guys have got brush, probably juniper, right up next to their house. And this one's got a big juniper tree right next to his house. So if those juniper trees catch fire, those houses are probably history too. They burned about 300 and something on this particular fire. Firebrands, sloping chimneys, and saddles. These are dangerous areas. Slopes with ladder fuels, saddles, chimneys. If you live uphill from a little old draw that's got a lot of little trees in it and stuff, you ought to be after the landowner down there to get it thin. Now I put this slide in there just to kind of show you the way a fire burned. This was the white fire. It burned through this area and burned the fine fuels. Burned the leaves off the trees and all those kind of things. The fire you see here are logs on the ground. They're the heavier fuels. And the fire went through it, caught them on fire, but it's still generating a lot of heat. But the importance of this is the same thing happens when a fire goes through town. Very few places are burned by the initial fire front. Most of them are burned by sparks and things that are left after the initial fire goes through. And so the better you prepare your home, and I don't want to be a fatalist, but don't depend on the fire department being there. If we get a fire coming through there and it's got a good front, there's just not enough firemen to cover all the houses. And so it's up to us to protect our houses as much as we can. This is another one. That looks like a pretty big fire there, but that's after the fire front's gone through. Those are all logs and little limbs and things that are still burning. And the same thing there. And this is the Wallow Canyon fire. The other thing that you can do in your ordinances is make the spacing between houses enough so one of the compressed fuel pellets doesn't catch the next one. But that's what happened to a lot of these homes. There weren't much vegetation around them, but they still burned a lot of homes. So that same thing happened out at the church camp. There were a lot of houses in a very small area, and we don't know, I wasn't there, but I suspect a lot of them were caught by the house next door. The other thing you ought to consider is access. If you want a firefighter to get in close to your house, he's got to be able to get his fire truck in there. So trees in your driveway and things ought to be able to accommodate the height of the fire engine. Put a good number on your house so they know where you are, who you are. Working in the village, that's one thing that kind of frustrates us is a lot of the places aren't marked. If they're marked, they're poorly marked. And they need to know where you live. Keep roadways free from overhanging vegetation. Vertical clearance is important. 16-foot access. And if there's a lot of homes, you may need a little bit wider one, allowing for two-way traffic so that you can have people leaving while firefighters are going in. Special considerations that you might have: know where your evacuation routes are. Know where you're going to leave if a fire comes your direction. Special needs. If you're in a wheelchair or require a walker or those kind of things, leave early. Don't wait. Livestock and pets. Nearly every fire anymore that you go to, there's a big to-do about pets being lost and horses being lost and all those kind of things. So if you're able, you ought to take care of those things on your way out. and safe areas. Now here in Red Osa, you don't think about it, but we have several areas that are fairly safe regardless of size of fire. Both golf courses are safe areas. Over there where the Baptist church is a really good safe area. Any area that's 100 yards around that you can get in the middle of will keep you from getting the radiant